Hello, this is Macarodon X, and right now I'm currently working on a little pencil drawing of one of my original dinosaur characters, which despite the name aren't really anthropomorphic nor do they talk like people, but they're much more bestial in nature, almost like untamed wild animals in a sense. And I've named this particular dinosaur after a certain famous Roman emperor, since his name sounds so cool for such a formidable creature. His name's Julius. He lives in the Hills of Fire, which lie towards the east of the island continent of Aetherosia, and he's a big, red and black, fire-breathing Carcharodontosaurus who's got a pair of imposing brow horns jutting out right above his eyes from either side of his head, which add up to his fearsome looks and are used to maul gorge monsters around his size, such as battle trolls or tall smaller creatures and objects around. And you can see that he's carrying a chomped up goblin soldier right here in the middle of his big toothy jaws. This is because the goblin dominated Thubanian Empire, which originally came from the northeast, had sent its troops to conquer much of the Hills of Fire, alongside their rival goblin empire, the Arpanians, for nearly 30 years, and Julius has been trying to fight off the goblins with his horns, jaws, and fiery breath ever since. But this rage of his is slowly consuming him and turning him into a monster. So before the outbreak of the Arpan-Thuban War, which happened towards the end of the 5th Age, Julius and his fellow Carcharodontosaurs were once the dominant top predators of Aetherosia, preying upon herbivores such as the Lambeosaur, Lophosaurus, and the big herbivorous kangaroo-like theropod Megapodosaurus. But once the goblins invaded, his kind were quickly driven to extinction along with the other dinosaurs and pterosaurs, until the Hills of Fire became the stronghold for the last surviving population, and Julius has been known to be the last surviving member of his kind ever since. So Julius is one of the characters who's going to appear in my upcoming epic romance, The Sorceress of Leaf and Sand. So as you've all known, I've been working on this story for over 10 years right now. I've been working on this story over the past 10 years. And the inspiration for the story came when I was originally in middle school, and I was obsessed with the 3 Hobbit movies while I was reading the Hobbit book by J.R.R. Tolkien. And this was December 2014, and I was also getting concerned about the retirement of Hayao Miyazaki at the time, because this is the year after he released his film The Wind Rises and officially announced his retirement, and the future of Studio Ghibli seems to be in a dire strait. So I was reading The Hobbit at this time, and afterwards, I went to watch the final movie in the series, and this was what inspired my big love of fantasy in the first place. And afterwards, I was so excited to learn more about the universe of Tolkien's world that I decided to get my hands on The Lord of the Rings in the spring of 2015, exactly 10 years ago. And this is the time when I was also given a lesson on propaganda from my middle school English and language arts teacher. And this the lesson was written in the context of this alien emperor from Neptune named Toxor the Just coming onto Earth and addressing the Earthlings about his intent to be a peaceful ruler of the people of Earth. And this speech, which had a big, huge impression on me, and I decided to include the character of Toxor the Just, as an inspiration for the villain of my then upcoming story. And this time I was also reading The Lord of the Rings, the entire trilogy, towards the middle of my middle school years, and I was so obsessed with the way Tolkien presents his world building, the way he presents these long, everlasting lessons about heroism, of hope in times of darkness and despair. And this is what inspired me to come up with a story that will eventually become the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand. So I've made the story I've envisioned this story as basically an homage and tribute to Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. Soon after he announced his retirement, and everybody thought that the fate of Studio Ghibli was about to be sealed once and for all. And I thought this was going to be the opportunity to create an epic story that would pay tribute to his works, especially once I was finished reading The Lord of the Rings, and I was so inspired by this story's lore, by the story's fully fleshed out world building and long-lasting themes, that I was fully inspired by this particular story to create a similar sort of epic romance that will pay homage to Hayao Miyazaki and incorporate many of his themes alongside Tolkien's, for the presentation of a truly everlasting story that will resonate with young people and people of all ages. So right now, as of this year, marks the 10th anniversary of the time I originally came up with the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand. And I was in middle school back then. And it was in this year, 2015, that I also came up with not only Julius, but also the story's title or protagonist, a 15-year-old girl who lives in the Western agricultural lands, and she has long black hair and a red dress, and she is prophesied to be the one who will fulfill this ancient prophecy that will determine the fate of the entire world around her. And Julius is just one of the many characters that she comes across. Initially, Julius appears to be this sort of monster who tries to chase Keiko around, but once Keiko looks at him and finds out that his rage towards the goblins is his fear of being completely exterminated, the fear of his kind being completely exterminated by these creatures, Keiko decides to empathize with Julius. Keiko decides to find a way to help Julius cope with his grief. And in turn, Julius agrees to help protect Keiko as she navigates through the dangerous desert lands of the Hells of Fire and towards the lands where the Great Canyon is. And in the story, I've also included a scene since this story is set during the middle of a war against two rival goblin empires and their human allies. I've also envisioned a scene where, in the middle of the climax, set in the middle of a burning forest, Julius nearly sacrifices his life to protect Keiko Yamamoto from this giant mechanical war elephant and loses a horn. But Keiko then thanks him for saving her life. And besides Keiko Yamamoto, there's this small little elf named Robbie Hyde who accompanies her on her travels to reach the so-called Forest of Hope. So Robbie Hyde was one of the very first characters I created when I envisioned the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand 10 years ago, alongside Keiko Yamamoto, Terius the Just, Julius, Kyofu, the kangaroo-like theropod dinosaur, and Arashi the Quetzalcoatlus. And another major inspiration for the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand were my lessons in history back in middle school, especially lessons about colonialism and imperialism and how those two groundbreaking policies in world history were spearheaded by those European empires from the 15th to the 20th centuries. And one lesson about colonialism and imperialism that I was most interested in was the scramble for Africa in the middle of the 1880s, when all those major European colonial powers decided to carve up the entire African continent for themselves and started creating their own geopolitical spheres of influence within the middle of the African continent, excluding Liberia to the west and Ethiopia to the east, as well as the time when all those European and Western influenced colonial powers started to create little spheres of influence for their own interests in the middle of the declining Qing Empire of China towards the end of the 19th century. And from these lessons in colonialism and imperialism, I began to wonder about how those two historical processes could have worked out in a world very different from our own, a world where magic and technology coexist side by side, a world that is heavily inspired and influenced by the philosophies of both Hayao Miyazaki and J.R.R. Tolkien. That was how I started envisioning the different varying power levels within the various races which inhabited the world of Sakaya, but especially the insular world that is the island continent of Aetherosia, and how all those races, goblins, humans, elves, etc., either coexisted or competed with each other, with varying levels of power struggles and political sophistication. And at the heart of this will to power, the will to dominate all other life on Earth, would be this magical artifact of doom, a single minuscule model of the entire world in the hands of a powerful monarch that will eventually become the Golden Master Orb, an object that wields terrifying power when it is misused in the hands of a power-hungry tyrannical monarch, and the very object placed within the branches of the lonely tree which sits in the middle of the Forest of Hope that Keiko Yamamoto has to destroy with the use of her magic in order to restore peace and order to the world around her. So, many of the characters who would become a central focus of the story, the first three, Keiko, Robbie Hyde, and Julius, were originally created all the way back in 2015, but Vicky the Raccoon, Robbie Hyde's trusty pet, and the knight Beziel the Bold, who becomes an ally of Keiko the Sorceress, they wouldn't come to prominence until about 2 years later, back in 2017, 8 years ago. So regarding the history of my story so far, I originally envisioned the characters of Keiko, Robbie Hyde, and Julius in 2015 alongside Arashi the Quetzalcoatlus and these kangaroo-like theropod dinosaurs called the Megapodosaurs, including a whole scene where Keiko rides one of them and the whole flock of these kangaroo-like dinosaurs escape a patrol of Tobanian warplanes that have come out to hunt them down. And I've also envisioned the scene where Keiko and Robbie arrive at the foot of the Great Canyon and use Arashi the Quetzalcoatlus to fly them across the landmark and high over 4 tall cliffs to reach a big, huge forest that will eventually become the Forest of Hope. And 2016 was the year when I made my very first draft of the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand, and the story is almost in many ways very different from the final version that I will be coming up with near the end of this year. But it was and the locations and everything like that were very, very different. Like in my very first draft, I originally wanted to set the story in the middle of the continental U.S. after some sort of apocalyptic war. But I thought that such a setting didn't work well with the kind of epic romance that I was coming up with. And in the 8 years since, I've shifted the story to some sort of a secondary world, a secondary world with different rules, with different peoples, different places, different creatures. A world that is very, very different from our own. A world where magic and technology coexist side by side. A world that is somehow rooted in the medieval histories of Europe and Asia, as well as the time period of 1914 to 1945, regarding the aesthetics and the technology. A world that is heavily inspired by the philosophies of both Miyazaki and Tolkien. The world of Sakaya, within which the island continent of Aetherosia, which is carried on the back of a gigantic island turtle in the middle of a vast ocean, resides. And over the next 8 years, I started writing more and more rough drafts of the story. So many of the story basically involves, and over time, my rough drafts evolved into this basic story where the title character, Keiko Yamamoto, is a young mage who is celebrating her 15th birthday, and she's given all these magical gifts by her grandmother Akiko. And those magical gifts are the crimson red dress with the crimson hat with the white bow attached to the front of it, 2 tall black boots, a magic staff with which the girl can use to channel forth her magical powers, and as well as some sort of a journal with a feather of everlasting ink, as well as a scrying stone, both of which Keiko does not use that very, very often. And soon, some mysterious tidings come from the east. This strange flying ship crash lands in the middle of the land that will become the Southwestern Glens, and on the next day, a fleet of all these airships and airplanes from the Imperial Thubanian army invade the Southwestern lands, headed by a Goblin Emperor, Tarius the Just, and Tarius the Just addresses the people of the Southwestern lands that he's there to protect everyone from the neighboring Arpanian Empire's army, and that he's there to protect the people of the Southwestern lands from the attacks from these dinosaurs, which he considers to be savage beasts that need to be exterminated. And that he's also come here to have the people of the Southwestern lands provide the food for his massive army. And it is within this context that Keiko tries to intervene but is stopped by Robbie Hyde, who proceeds to take her deep into the borderland woods, which straddle both the Southwestern lands to the west and the green marshes to the east. And within those next 8 years, I've also included Robbie Hyde's big pet talking raccoon, Vicky, as well as the knight, Bezio the Bold, who is out to protect his kingdom from the encroachments of both the Arpanian and Thubanian empires, since the kingdom he serves, the county of Comtea, is a small feudal state which lies in the middle of the interests of both the Arpanian and Thubanian empires. And the main goal of Keiko's quest is to reach the Forest of Hope, where this gigantic camphor tree resides with this magical artifact of doom, the golden orb placed upon the middle of its branches. And the main objective of Keiko's quest is to go deep into the Forest of Hope, find the lonely tree, and destroy the golden master orb with the use of her magic, and therefore restore peace and order back into not only Aetherosia but also to the entirety of Sakaya once and for all. And it is with this basic plotline in mind that I've come up with many of the different lands that Keiko and her companions come across on their quest to reach the Forest of Hope. These include the Green Marshes, a land of towering cypress swamps and oak forests dominated by gigantic alligators, There's the Black Mountains, which is partly inspired by the European Alps, as well as the mountains of Central Asia, in regards to its scenery and aesthetics and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the Sulphur Plains, a gigantic expanse of grassland, which is home to the kangaroo-like dinosaurs called the Megapodosaurs, as well as the Sands of Fate, and which is this gigantic expanse of shifting sand dunes that Keiko and her friends have to cross in order to reach this underground passageway that will lead them to the Hills of Fire where Julius resides. And as my artwork, drawings, and writings were quickly evolving over the years, I started to watch more and more of Hayao Miyazaki's films. First of all, the very first Hayao Miyazaki movie that I've ever watched was My Neighbor Totoro. That was when I was just a child. And then when I got older, I started to watch more Miyazaki films, such as Kiki's Delivery Service, and Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, and Castle in the Sky, both of which I appreciate very, very greatly for their epic themes and sort of epic scope, as well as Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, and Princess Mononoke. And I've kept on watching all these films over and over again to better understand how Hayao Miyazaki hones in his signature art style, his signature themes, the signature ways in which characters do things in order to further envision my story as an homage to Miyazaki. I have to watch many of the director's most famous movies in order to understand all the themes, the universal themes he's trying to present in many of his films, which have been cherished by new generations of animators and storytellers as perennial works of art ever since. And besides watching the films of Hayao Miyazaki over and over in order to fully understand his art style, themes, and his vision for the world, I've also watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy many, many times in order to appreciate all the work, all the effort that Peter Jackson and his team at Weta Studios did to bring the complex world of Middle-earth to life in the medium of cinema. And I personally believe the Lord of the Rings trilogy is probably the single greatest live-action film series of this century. And I've been rewatching these films for many of the same reasons as Miyazaki's, in order to fully understand the overall themes and message that Tolkien is trying to convince the world to follow with its epic story and world building, and therefore incorporate many of these aspects which have made The Lord of the Rings so beloved among both professional academics and critics, and casual media consumers alike, into my story, so that it will celebrate, embrace, and combine the visions of those two legendary paragons of fantasy fiction into the creation of a wholly new fairy tale which will truly resonate with the cultural, environmental, political, and social issues and youth of the 21st century. And a comprehensive analysis and breakdown of what makes both Miyazaki and Tolkien similar and different to each other regarding their thematic methods of storytelling will be coming soon, so stay tuned. So far, I've been working as hard as I can to fully flesh out and publish the final version of the epic romance that is the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand into 3 different formats. The first one is this conceptual storybook that I started working on in March of this year and finally finished just a month ago, that contains most of the events of the final version of the story, presented in a condensed format with lots of illustrations and accompanying text. You can find the conceptual storybook on DeviantArt, and it is the first complete version of the Sorceress of Leaf and Sand that I've published so far. The second version will be this literary version, which I'm still working on, and the text and chapters will be found on my DeviantArt page as usual. And the final version will be this graphic novel format, which presents a much more detailed account of the events from the storybook, along with visual interpretations of events and scenes straight from the literary version. And once the literary and graphic novel versions of The Sorceress of Leaf and Sand are fully realized by the end of this year, I will publish them on my DeviantArt and Tumblr, along with the conceptual storybook, which is the only complete version of The Sorceress of Leaf and Sand ever made so far. So the past 10 years have truly been a tedious time for the history of my epic romance, as I've tried as much as I could to flesh out its characters and creatures, locations, overall plot and themes, and lore. And Tolkien has famously stated in an interview in the 1950s that it took him over 14 years for him to fully develop and publish the literary masterpiece of his that is The Lord of the Rings. So I hope my story goes in a similar trajectory, and since this year is very important for me as it marks the 10th anniversary of The Sorceress of Leaf and Sand's conception, I'll be working as hard as I can to fully realize and publish the literary and graphic novel versions of the epic romance and get them published before the end of this year. After all, I would like to thank you for heeding this truly momentous update on the history and progress of my Tolkien-inspired homage and tribute to Hayao Miyazaki so far. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like these, and I'll see you soon.